Hello and welcome to The Dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and in today's video we are going to be talking about dungeons and why I like dungeons and how to try to run better dungeons. And we're going to be talking about some player point of view and some dungeon master point of view, and just kind of like, I don't know, just talking about dungeons and how to make them better and more memorable experiences. Because I think that sometimes dungeons kind of get a bad reputation sometimes, and I don't think that's necessarily deserved. And by the way, when I say dungeons, I'm just really talking about any type of scenario in which the players are going to have to go through a lot of encounters, maybe deal with some traps or not, but going to have to run like a gauntlet style series of encounters probably. And maybe they can bluff their way through or get through a stealth, whatever. They're not saying they have to all be combat encounters, but the basic idea is going to be they're going to have to run a gauntlet of stuff to accomplish their objective, right? So maybe it's a dungeon. Maybe it's a castle they're trying to invade. Maybe it's some sort of like weird demi-plane, whatever the scenario is, right? But basically, just where they're going to be unable to just take frequent rests whenever and however they want. And really, to me, that's one of the big keys of running a good dungeon, especially in 5th edition. I like a lot of like third-party type stuff. I've played a lot of other role-playing games as well, and a lot of people have this attitude that they want less encounters but more memorable encounters. And by the way, I am completely on board with that idea. I really do think that that's an important aspect of game design. However, I also think that the way 5th edition works, because you have so many abilities that recharge on short rests or long rests, and because players have so many tools in their arsenal these days. Like fighters didn't used to have things like action surge. Paladins couldn't use all their spell slots on smites. Like these kind of things didn't really exist in some of the previous editions of the game. And now, if your players only have 1 or 2 encounters in a day, and they know they can take a short rest after every encounter, then there's no reason for them not to like all drop all their biggest abilities every single time. And the reason I like dungeons or other scenarios like that is because you can force players to have to start budgeting their resources and having to make some really critical decisions about what they want to use. And to me, a lot of the best like fights and most memorable encounters we've ever had in any of my campaigns have been when players have been really pushed to the limit. It's when players are, basically out of options and they're looking at their character sheet, desperately trying to find that one thing that might be able to turn this fight around and save the party. And then they somehow manage to do that. Those are the kind of fights they are always going to talk about and always remember. And you can't make those kind of things happen. They sort of happen organically. But I find they're much more likely to happen when the party has really been pushed to its limits. And that's one thing I like about dungeon type of scenarios, is that because there's so many encounters and maybe the players are on the clock and they can't afford to take long rests, and now they have to get through all these different stages in order to accomplish whatever they're accomplishing, get the MacGuffin, save the world, whatever, that this is when they really have to start being creative and resourceful. And I've had fights where going in, I didn't even know if my players were going to be able to win the fight at all. I'm like, yeah, they might all die here. And I don't want to kill my players, right? I want to be able to play the game with them and go through the story or the world that I've created for them. My objective isn't to kill the players. But if there's no risk of death, then there's no real reward for playing either. It gets very, very stale and dull if the players know in advance there's no chance of defeat. And so look, we've had TPKs before. It sucks, but that's part of the game. And honestly, I think in 5th edition, the game has never been more forgiving of death. We didn't used to have things like Revivify, You had Raise Dead and you had Resurrection. And if you were willing to take your chances, you had Reincarnate, which nobody really used ever, But nowadays, like, Paladins can resurrect people. A 5th level Cleric can resurrect you, Revivify is a great spell. And they don't even necessarily have to have it prepared. Like, they could be a Life Cleric, and now it's just always prepared. As long as they had 1 spell slot left to cast it with, of appropriate level, then they're good, And so I think that don't be too afraid to push your players. And yeah, maybe they do have some hardships, and maybe it is rough on them a couple times. But trust me, when you have those like really good game sessions where the players are really pushed to the limits and find a way to achieve victory, those are the games that they're just gonna be like, man, that was like the best game ever, and they are just gonna be so thrilled and excited by it. And so that's kind of why I like Dungeons, because I find that those kind of scenarios come about a lot more frequently because you're just naturally pushing the players a lot harder. I actually found my old original first edition. It's not my original Player's Handbook. That was the old Keep on the Borderlands days. But I found this one, and it just kind of made me laugh because I saw that picture in the bottom corner there, and it just reminded me of like the old days where, you know, everybody had to have like a 10-foot pole. That was just mandatory for dungeoning, and you'd poke the floor as you went to, you know, see if there were traps or other pressure plates ahead or anything. In that picture there, in case you couldn't see, it's an adventurer like laying out string in the maze so that they can find their way back again. But there's like a troll following behind them, raveling the string back up again into a ball while they're going. And I think that's a pretty funny picture, to be honest. We used to have like followers and henchmen and stuff, and that's not really as much of a thing these days. But sometimes, you know, if you're using a greatsword but you need a lantern, well, I mean, you've only got 2 hands, and you need those hands for that greatsword. So you just hire some schmuck from the local, you know, Keep on the Borderlands to walk along behind you holding a lantern so that you can see in the dungeon. You know, he doesn't have to do anything. You still have to pay him though, because he is putting his life at risk. But, you know, his job is literally just to point a lantern. And, you know, that was just kind of a fun aspect of the game back then. And I think that over time, the game has evolved a lot. You know, it used to be that just knowing that there's a dungeon nearby was all the reason players needed to go do a dungeon. Like, that's literally the story of Keep on the Borderlands. Your players are at a keep on the Borderlands, and nearby are the Caves of Chaos, which are filled with monsters, and some of those monsters have treasure. That's it. That's the scenario. There's no real compelling reason to go there. Yeah, they have some adventure hooks they talk about that you can try to give your players if they want a reason. But really, just the fact that your players are adventurers and there's a dungeon was considered to be reason enough. And I think that these days, that's not really the case. Players have evolved a lot since then, and I think that's for the good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing by any means, you know. But I was joking with a friend of mine earlier today. I was talking about this idea for a video, and one of the players I've played with before, and I was saying, you know, like, if he doesn't have a story reason for something, he has no interest in doing it whatsoever. You know, so if he finds out, like, oh, there's a cave over there and it's full of monsters, he'll be like, oh, thank you, good sir, for your warning. We will be sure to stay well clear of that place and to give it a wide berth. Thank you for your service. And like, you'll just have no interest in going there at all, right? And you're like, oh, that's kind of the story. I kind of wanted you guys to. It's okay. I'll just say somebody got kidnapped, and I'll put them in a random room, I guess, and then the players can go there. You know, and as soon as they have a reason, then they're like, oh, we have to go save the maiden? Of course we'll do that. Oh, we have to save the local blacksmith? Completely on board for that, you know. Find the MacGuffin, we're down for it. But just go there for the heck of it? Why would we do that? A man could get killed doing something like that. I mean, come on. That sounds like a great place to avoid. And, you know, that's just the way the game is these days. And like I said, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that storytelling has advanced a lot. And, you know, that's for the good. But I do want to say that I still kind of like a lot of those historic roots. And like I said, I like it because sometimes just having lots of combat encounters can be a lot of fun, and just fighting stuff. That can be okay. I also think that dungeons get a bad rap sometimes because we act like there's no role-playing opportunities in dungeons. And that's really not the case. There's been tons of times where, you know, our players have found prisoners and then interacted with them or done other things like that. One of my favorite NPCs ever The first character I made for 5th edition, right? I've played previous editions, of course, but then we were playing a bunch of other games, specifically Shadowrun for a while, and we decided to try 5th edition D&D because we'd heard good things about the rule set. So we bought our books and decided to play some Dungeons and Dragons. And I decided I'd spent the last few years playing a mage in Shadowrun, and I just wanted to play the exact opposite of that. And usually I like my caster types, but I just decided I'm going to make a half-orc, and I was caught between barbarian and champion fighter because I just wanted to just the most basic, streamlined, big bruiser type I could make, and I ended up going with champion. And honestly, he was a great character, and yeah, he was just a lot of fun. But at one point, we rescued this guy named Chon Chon, and I think Chon Chon, the DM originally said he was a gnoll, but I think he meant kobold because he kind of got retconned later into just being this little tiny kobold. But Borag, my champion fighter, killed whatever it was that was imprisoning Chon Chon and decided to free him, and Chon Chon became his like bannerman essentially, you know? And it's funny because Chon Chon essentially became my caddy, and everywhere Borag went, he just had like all these magical weapons. And the problem was I didn't have any really outstanding magical weapons for a long time. I just had a collection of like really generic, crappy magical weapons for different chores, right? But it was, you know, it'd be like, Chon Chon, give me the 7-iron, you know, and he'd like hand me a great sword +1 or whatever. And, you know, just for every task, it'd be like, Chon Chon, give me my long sword, you know, give me my shield, you know. And he'd just always hand me different weapons. And it just became really funny. And then Chon Chon became this like NPC with a lot of like really funny personality. And he'd always make these like really stupid jokes. But just the idea of like this little kobold carrying around this collection of armor and weapons and shields for this stupid giant half-orc that's like 6'6", you know, and my little like 4'0" retainer there carrying all the stuff for me. It just became really funny, and it was like this running gag that went throughout the entire campaign. But that campaign eventually went all the way to 20, and Chon Chon was there right till the end, you know. So it was fun, and the whole party just ended up really liking Chon Chon. He was just this idiot, but he was just so much fun to roleplay with. And that was just some random creature in a dungeon that wasn't supposed to mean really anything at all, right? But because I decided to roleplay with him and interact with him and then be like friendly to him and stuff, and like Borag was also pretty arrogant, and he always referred to himself in the third person, of course. But Borag was a really fun character to roleplay, probably because I didn't have a lot of combat options since I was a champion fighter. It was like, to action surge or not to action surge, and that's really the only question. But because of that, I didn't really have a lot of other things to distract me, so I just spent all my free time thinking of ridiculous ways to roleplay the character, and Borag was just so much fun to play. But a lot of that interaction came about just because, well, everybody else was like, oh, we freed the guy, he can find his own way out. And I was like, oh, come on, guys, let's help him out at least, you know? And then he was like trying to like make me happy because I was the one who wanted to take him with us and stuff. And then I was just like getting him to carry extra stuff for me because the DM was kind of being a little weird about encumbrance all of a sudden from out of nowhere. Decided that maybe Borag couldn't carry 7 weapons and a shield while wearing full plate armor all at the same time. I mean, unrealistic expectations does he have for my poor half-orc, you know? And then I was like, well, I'll get him to carry a bunch of this stuff. He won't care. And they're like, oh, maybe he cares. And then I like rolled a natural 20 on my persuasion roll, and he didn't care, it turned out. He was more than happy to carry my gear for me. But I've been in a lot of different dungeon scenarios where maybe you have different factions of monsters, and players can like get in good with one group and then use them to help them against the other group and, you know, take sides. You don't have to like kick down the front door and just go room by room murdering everything in the dungeon. Although, you know, you could. That might be fun too, right? But I'm saying that there are always role-playing opportunities in every aspect of the game. And even in dungeons where we sometimes don't look for them, they still abound. So, you know, just be aware of that. Some of the funnest and most weird and zany role-playing encounters my party's ever had have just been like random throwaway NPCs that we've met like in dungeons or wherever, even in cities. In the current campaign I'm running, there is this guy who has this like menagerie, and he keeps trying to recruit the players to be in his menagerie. even though they have literally no reason to do it at all. So of course they always refuse, right? But every time he's met them, they've had like weird things with them, right? Like at first they were just a weird looking group of people with like, you know, much like very diverse group with like halflings and orcs and, you know, dragonborn, everything else. Like they're just this weird multiracial group, and they seemed kind of weird and extravagant, and so he kind of was interested. And then like he ends up meeting them later, and I think the druid had like summoned up a bunch of like woodland beings. So now they've got this whole like army of like ferrets and stuff running around with them. So now he's like even more interested. And then the next time he meets them, they've got like even more stuff. And then finally they end up meeting this one NPC, and she'd been like imprisoned, but she was supposed to be the heir to like the throne essentially of her area, and she was actually had married this other guy who was like the ruler of this other area, and it was like a political marriage. They weren't really technically in love, although they got along fine. But basically the idea was these two, you know, heirs from each house, they're gonna get married, unify their houses, and become the most powerful group in the land, right? But they end up getting betrayed. He gets murdered. She gets her hand chopped off and gets locked up in a garden by her dad, who is one of the conspirators. So the party ends up like finding her after she's already gotten her freedom and escaped and stuff. And she's essentially gotten back most of her like retainers and stuff and has the throne back, right? And this one player has bought himself an elephant as well, the gnome wizard in the party. He has an elephant that he now rides, and he has like a handler who like drives the elephant for him. And now they've got this girl with her like escort of like 100 soldiers, and they've all got banners, they've got like trumpeteers, and they like come like marching into town with, you know, the same like weird menagerie of people or I shouldn't say menagerie, but the same group of exotic characters they've already had, with an elephant and some like basically her like personal bodyguard of like 100 soldiers with like, you know, like banners everywhere, and they run into the same guy again, and he's just like, what are you people doing? And now he's like worried they're gonna put him out of business because his menagerie can't possibly compete. But it was just this like running gag that just kept coming back over and over again. And every time the players came back to this same city, they just had more ridiculous stuff with them. And it just became like this really funny like thing where they'd always be like role playing with this guy. And it was just ridiculous, but it was also great. So anyway, that's an aside. My point though is, we often think that like, oh, this is going to be like a role play scenario, and this is going to be a combat scenario, and this is going to be our exploration scenario. And there's no reason it couldn't be all three in one. We've had plenty of times where exploration led to discovery, which led to combat, which led to the dark side, of course. But, you know, I like the idea that any situation could be a social situation if you're willing to, you know, take a chance on it. So just because it's a dungeon doesn't mean there's not great opportunities for roleplay. I wanted to say too, as far as like how big of dungeons to run, I kind of think that's a personal choice, and you really need to know your group and know your party. My players tend to be very goal and like objective focused, right? So if I give them a dungeon, I don't want to run something like, you know, World's Biggest Dungeon or Repan of Thok or even like Undermountain or something, because they don't seem to like it when they spend week after week after week after week after week in the dungeon. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they're okay with that, but usually there has to be some sort of objective that they want to accomplish. But I know I personally, as a player, I don't really care. I could do Dungeons and Mad Mage and be perfectly happy playing that. Or I could play something that's way more roleplay happy or heavy, and I'll be happy with that too. It doesn't matter to me, right? So I think it's important to kind of know your players and sort of see like how much dungeon do they want, right? So like Repan of Thok is something a lot of people might not be familiar with. It's by Frog God Games, so another third-party group. But it's honestly one of the toughest and greatest dungeons I've ever seen. And unlike, say, Tomb of Annihilation, which is really just designed to kill players, Repan of Thok has a lot of those aspects, but I also feel like it's more fair to players too, and has a lot more creativity behind it. So I quite like it, but I would never try to like run my party through the entire dungeon. And the reason is because A, there's certain aspects of it that just don't really make sense to me. Like there's certain things where you have secret hidden doors, which are like the only way to proceed deeper into the dungeon and stuff, right? And if your players don't find it, they're just gonna get frustrated. That's not necessarily bad every now and then, but when it's like, if you've got a dungeon that's like 30 or 40 levels, including all the sub levels, I don't even know how big it is. It's a huge dungeon. And then there's like auxiliary dungeons as well. It's just insanely big, right? And if the only way to get to where they're going is, they have to find a secret thing behind the waterfall on this level, and they have to find a secret door that's hidden somewhere else on this level. Oh, and then it turns out there's like a lake, and the lake has like a sinkhole, and if they go down the sinkhole and don't drown to death, then eventually it'll take them like to this other area, and they'll fall out into this other area, and then they'll be on like a different level of the dungeon. Doing that once is okay. Doing that like 10 times gets a little old, and I have no reasonable expectation that my players are ever going to find all these things to proceed properly through the dungeon. And especially if I'm giving them an objective, which is usually the heart of the dungeon, right? Then I want them to have a chance to succeed. And if they fail, it's going to be because they made bad choices, it's because the dice were just really against them that day, or something along those lines. But it's not going to be because they, failed to find the one and only secret door that led to where they want to go, right? So I like to have multiple paths to victory in my dungeons. Some people might not, right? Like I said, like certain dungeons, like the Tomb of Horrors was designed by Gary Gygax to kill players because they had a group of players who were bragging about how the game was too easy and their characters were so powerful, there was no challenge they couldn't beat. And he was just like, okay, well, let's see about that. And so he designed the Tomb of Horrors. And personally, I don't like the Tomb of Horrors much. It's one of my least favorite adventures ever. And the fact that it's been published in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition is a little annoying to me, considering that there's a lot of great adventures that just don't get republished ever, But I also think that certain players like those kind of dungeons too, because they want to be the guys who said, we beat the Tomb of Horrors. And not because the DM took it easy on us, but because we were just that smart and we were that good and we, were like so thorough with everything we did that we managed to beat the dungeon. And that is something worth bragging about, especially back in the 1st and 2nd edition days, because the Demi-Lich was ridiculous back then. So, it could only even be hurt by like certain specific things, which your party may or may not have even had access to at all. So it might have been an absolutely no-win scenario before they even went into the dungeon. But and personally, I don't like that kind of stuff. Like I said, I want to push my players. I want to push them to the limit, and even beyond the limit sometimes, force them to find new limits. But I also want them to have a chance of victory. And maybe that's just me, but I think most of us probably are in that same boat. We don't want to feel like we're just killing our players for no reason. I want my players and I to have a great experience playing the game together, and the best games tend to be the ones when the players really, really have to dig deep and find some way to win, but it's usually when they do win. So, anyways, that's another aside. So, I will often steal levels from dungeons and, pick things that are like of the appropriate level, or just reskin all the monsters, change them out entirely, with things that are more appropriate for the level range or whatever, right? And I think that kind of stuff is fine. But I like to keep my dungeons to like usually 2 to 4 game sessions at most, right? But like I said, that's just my own party. And then usually I have some sort of objective. One of the best dungeons I've run in a long time, and this was not an original dungeon, but basically I took the adventure Deathfrost Doom from Lamentations of the Flame Princess and basically just converted it to 5th edition, right? And it is a really creepy dungeon. It is kind of designed to kill players too, so I made some changes to the end to give my players a chance to figure out what was going on. But it was really creepy, and it was really atmospheric, and there were some really interesting things that I liked a lot about it. And so I kind of wanted to talk about how to like invoke good atmosphere in your dungeons. And like I said, I also ran in the last campaign a haunted house type scenario, and my players really loved that one as well, and thought that it was like one of the best dungeons that they'd ever done. And in both cases, it was like a creepy, nice horror slash fantasy mix. And I don't really like necessarily horror campaigns, but I love mixing a lot of horror in certain areas. I think when you just go all horror all the time, sometimes it can kind of blunt it a little bit. But when your players are used to like high fantasy and all of a sudden it turns into a horror adventure, it can be a really unsettling and creepy experience, which automatically just kind of like raises up that tension and makes things more interesting for the players. So, I like to include like general descriptions of things, and then if the players ask for more detail, I'll give it to them, right? But I also like to include a lot of like weird things that they can't necessarily account for, right? So in the haunted house scenario, in different times they would like activate kind of like different memories and stuff where they'd see weird things that had happened and kind of get the history of the house and of what like happened in it. And I really liked that idea a lot. Basically, I just stole it from like a bunch of different horror movies, right? Where I kind of had this idea of this guy who like was like this evil wizard, and he ended up going. I was gonna say he went crazy, but that's not actually true. He actually tried to summon something, and he got possessed, and ended up like murdering his family, and ended up dying, right? But you know, so they kind of start seeing this stuff play out, and they find out the room where his wife got murdered, and like when they touch something, they see her like ghost like screaming and like comes running right towards the player, and then like passes right through him, and then you know like takes a few steps beyond him, and then like falls dead from some sort of like attack, and they don't really see it, but they get the feeling there's some sort of like magical attack against her and stuff, and that kind of stuff really can creep players out. I like to like sometimes make them make random saving throws and those kind of things, or ability score checks, and no matter what the result is, it doesn't really change things. But like I was running this one like Lovecraftian type story that I just called The King in Yellow, and this was my own scenario that I invented. But a lot of the players in their dreams, they'd go to Carcosa, which is like the home base slash prison of the King in Yellow, right? It's just this giant city, and I'd have players like make like perception rolls and stuff, and then if they failed, they'd just hear something, and when they'd look, there'd be like nothing there, right? But they'd hear like footsteps, or they'd hear like somebody like whispering or something. When they looked, there's nothing there. But even if they boss rolled it, hopefully my players don't watch this video, but if they boss rolled it, they still didn't see anything. It's just then they turn and they think they'd like catch a glimpse of somebody, and then that person was gone or whatever, and they were like gone in the shadows. The whole point was though just to kind of like creep them up or creep them out, increase that type of tension and mood, and I really like doing that kind of stuff. I like to make use of things like cover, and I don't do this as much as I should. I used to do it a lot better, and I've really fallen out of the habit, and I need to do this a lot more. But you know, if you've got a giant throne room, for example, right? You've got the king, and he's got his wizard advisor guy, and then he's got some guards, and a bunch of guys have crossbows. Don't be afraid to have some of them like run to like the pillars that you just said were like holding up the roof, and then take cover and start like shooting crossbows from behind the pillars at the party. And hopefully this will encourage your party members to do similar things. And I think the dungeon becomes a lot better when players start to interact with the environment rather than just see it as a bunch of like tiles if you're using a map, or we use more theater of the mind, but a lot of times for big fights we've got like a whiteboard, and I'll like draw out the room, and we'll like label everybody, and then they can move themselves around, and we'll just, you know, do that kind of thing. And that works quite well as well. I like it. But like some of the best fights I've had have been because like we had one scenario in the White Spire campaign where they're fighting. They're trying to save a bunch of villagers who've been kidnapped, and they teamed up with these two NPCs, right, who were from the village, and they're fighting all these like evil cannibal dwarves, and a bunch of the dwarves are like evil paladins. I love evil paladins, in case people haven't figured out. These are not the Flayer paladins I mentioned in my last video. These are different evil paladins, and they worship this like giant demon worm god thing. That's actually from the Tome of Beasts. Tome of Beasts over there. Anyway, so they worship this giant worm thing. But it was like drove everything out, and the one barbarian player suddenly realized that because they were fighting over this like pit where there was like lava and stuff at one point, that he could just start grappling people and throwing them into the pit. And so he just started doing that. And he'd just like grab a guy, throw him into the pit. Grab the next guy, throw him into the pit. And as it turned out, that was a good move to a certain extent because it eliminated a lot of the combatants way faster. You didn't have to eliminate all their hit points. You could just throw them into the lava pit. But then something began moving and thrashing around in the giant lava pit, which of course was the giant demon worm god creature. So once the players realized, like, the worm god that they were sacrificing villagers to, and now we're sacrificing the evil dwarves to, is coming that much closer to coming out of the pit. Maybe we should change tactics. But it was a really cool fight because, like, you can see it was one of the first fights where I had where players really started to realize, like, oh, we can do things besides just hit them with our weapons or cast a spell at them and do damage, right? Like, we can interact with the game in other ways. And I've had fights where we had like a bar fight in one game, which was a lot of fun. And players are attacking people with like mugs of ale or like a stool on a chair leg, right? And like nobody wants to draw a sword because that's like this escalation that nobody quite wants to go to, and they're in a town, so they kind of start to understand, like, when they make somebody mad, and instead of grabbing his sword, he grabs a mug of ale and swings at the players, they're kind of like, oh, okay, it's going to be one of those kind of things. And I think that those kind of fights can be a lot of fun as a nice, like, change of pace. And again, that's not necessarily about a dungeon, but it's about, like, evoking a certain type of mood and atmosphere, and just allowing yourself to like do combats or do other things in a different type of manner. Another thing about atmosphere, I've seen people who use music and stuff before. I've actually tried that before. So it can be a little rough sometimes when you start having like technical problems and stuff, and if the music's too loud, then sometimes that can be awkward. But I do kind of like it. I think especially like some nice creepy music for like more horror-based scenarios is really good. So we kind of put the mood into things. I like to often make like references to like the tunnels and stuff, right? So I actually got this idea just from reading the Wheel of Time books by Robert Jordan. And there's a scene in those books where one of the evil characters is going to see the Dark Lord, the Dark One, and he's walking down this tunnel, and the Dark One has like this other servant with him too, right? And he starts, all of a sudden, like the tunnel starts like brushing his head and is forcing him to like get down lower, and he has to kind of like stoop a bit. But he realizes that the tunnel for this other guy hasn't changed. And that guy's just walking along just fine. And it's only when he gets to the tunnel area, the tunnel's just like magically just shorter for him. And now he's just forcing him down lower. And I thought it was a really creepy effect. And so it's something I like to try to do with different players sometimes, where maybe somebody makes, like, they have to make some sort of like check or roll or something, and somebody fails, and now they start experiencing the dungeon a little differently than other people, right? Maybe the dungeon doesn't actually change height, maybe he just feels like it is, and that can be a really cool, creepy effect. Even just like constantly mentioning things like, you know, like if you got a player who's like, you know, the barbarian in the party who's like 7 feet high, right? And then you mention that the roof is like 6.5 feet high. And every time he's trying to do something, you mention how he has to like stoop down. Then players will start to like clue into that, and it starts changing the way they role play the character. Maybe they start like playing the stoop and, you know, playing that they're hunched over all the time. And that kind of stuff can be fun. And then when you start changing the height of the corridor, that like starts drawing players in a little bit more too, right? Like now the height's gotten even lower, you know, and now the half orc who's only 6.5 feet tall is starting to have problems, you know. But then started coming up to some other area. Now the roof is like 15 feet high. And then when they find the giant double doors, and the doors are like 14 feet high, and they're made of like solid metal, and they've got like, they're like all boarded up from this side, not from the other side. And players are just like, holy crap, like, what are they trying to lock in there, you know? Do we even want to open this door? Like, that kind of stuff could really heighten anticipation of different areas and can really create like a lot of tension and mood. And it's not even hard to do. You just have to like put a few more moments of thought into like how you want to explain things or how you want to like change things up, and just change players' expectations a little bit, which can have some really, really fun and dramatic effects. I really think that trying to like not break players' sense of immersion, right? So this kind of goes to that whole like monster condo, monster hotel type idea, right? And I don't know if I mentioned that or not in this video. I can't remember. I've already forgotten. But the idea of the monster hotel is basically, you know, you got a bunch of goblins in one room, and the room next door has a bunch of like kobolds, and then the next room has a bunch of skeletons, and 2 doors down there's a minotaur, and like it doesn't really make any logical sense why all these creatures are living in close proximity to one another and how they're all just getting along. Like, you know, why wouldn't the minotaur just kill them all? Why wouldn't the skeletons just kill them all if they're undead? Maybe they're immune to magical, non-magical weapons or whatever, right? Well, skeletons aren't, but you know what I'm saying. Maybe there's some wights or ghouls or specters or whatever else, you know? I like to have logical reasons for things to happen, and I like to try to kind of keep some sort of theme to a lot of my dungeons, because I find it helps me to stay on track a lot more easily, right? And that doesn't mean you still can't do the whole monster condo thing sometimes, because that can be fun too. In my last campaign, and this was at like at high levels, the players found this one like prison, but the final level of prison was actually like this like demi-plane that was kind of on the moon in a way, but not really, kind of though. And basically it was just like all these super powerful like entities that had been like trapped and imprisoned here over the years so they wouldn't, you know, destroy the world kind of thing, right? Now, one of them was Bahamut, by the way, and so the one player managed to help free Bahamut, and he was very happy since he was a Path of the Zealot barbarian, but he was a dragonborn, and he liked Bahamut. But it was really kind of cool because it gave me a chance to do like high-level monster condo, and each room was like its own separate demi-plane essentially, where these things were imprisoned. And so it kind of made sense that, you know, you don't have to worry about the ecology. They're all like trapped in their own separate demi-planes, unless the players go in there and free them, of course, which they did on a couple before they started realizing maybe we just shouldn't open every door we find. But it was kind of a fun scenario. I liked it a lot. And just in general, I want to try to like have a theme or an idea, like I said. It doesn't always work that way. And, you know, like, as in all things, I'm not the expert either. I've run really boring dungeons. I've run generic dungeons. I've run dungeons that my players probably just couldn't wait to get out of and had no interest in doing ever again. Probably not even the first time. You know, but we do these experiences. We hopefully learn from them. We adapt. We find things that like we're like, hey, that was actually a really great dungeon. What did I do different with that one? Why were all my players like so engaged in it? And like, oh wait, I had like all that like weird horror stuff that seemed to be working pretty well for me. Oh, and then I had this other dungeon. I did some like weird creepy stuff in that one too. Like maybe that's where I kind of really start to shine as a dungeon master with those type of scenarios, you know? And you start to figure out like what you're good at, what you're not so good at, and you know, hopefully you put it all together and find a nice little package, you know? As another aside, today is just, you know, me talking about random things video, apparently, not specifically dungeons half the time. That was where the original idea for Ravenloft came from, because Tracy Hickman was doing some dungeon that his buddy had designed, and they ended up fighting some vampire, and he just remembered thinking, he's like, why would there be a vampire there? Like, that really made no sense. And the vampire kind of had a bit of backstory and stuff. But it's like, man, like, this guy probably should have just had, like, his own dungeon type of thing. And then they started thinking about the idea of having a really great D&D villain, because D&D is more just generic monsters. You kill those monsters, whatever. And maybe you've got some archdevils and some demon princes and some other like epic type of creatures like Tiamat or Bahamut or whatever that are like these legendary type of creatures. But for the most part, a vampire is a vampire, and nobody really ever cared. And then he came up with the idea of like, what if I make the vampire the main key focus of this entire scenario? And I give him this backstory, and the whole kind of like demi-plane world thing that he exists in essentially revolves around him. And all of a sudden you have this idea of like a completely different type of adventure, which led to Ravenloft, which was really one of the greatest D&D adventures of all time, and especially for the era. It really kind of changed the way that people started thinking about dungeons as a huge step forward in like the evolution of the gameplay. And that basically came about because one guy just decided, why is there a vampire here? That makes no sense. But how would it make sense? And how could I do it differently and maybe make the idea better? And that's how we got Ravenloft. And eventually Ravenloft became its own campaign setting, and I personally love Ravenloft. I remember running Ravenloft for some friends and my next door neighbor. And I remember we finished it, and I was like, man, that was a really good dungeon. And a few minutes after I remember thinking that, my one friend was like, that was the best game we've ever played. And I was like, what? And then a couple of the other guys were like, yeah, seriously, that was probably, for pre-written published stuff, that was the best game we've ever had. And I was like, wow, look, it wasn't just me running the game then. It was everybody else thought that too, And a lot of it was because it had this theme and this mood and atmosphere, and everything kind of like served the overall story. So that's my thoughts on how to tie this all together, I guess. We've accidentally come full circle and made a point. Despite my best intentions, I've actually made some constructive points now. Darn it. Oh well. It's not too late for me to still ruin things. Don't worry. Anyways, so I really like those type of atmospheric ideas. I like invoking some sort of theme or mood. I like to give my players a reason for their objectives, something that they can hopefully accomplish. Because of time frame, that like I said, the objective really could just be, you guys are just going to go do this mega dungeon, and we're just going to do 1 to 20 in a giant freaking dungeon. And your players might be totally cool with that, and I know I personally would be totally cool with that. I love that kind of stuff. But not every group has to be that way, and there's nothing wrong with groups wanting more. I think that's also a very, very reasonable and valid standard to have, So I like to give my players a reason for their objectives. I like to make things interesting. I recently ran a dungeon, and I stole this one. I think it was called Sword of Air. It was another Frog God game project. And Sword of Air Adventure is like 900 pages long or something like that. So I did not do the entire scenario, needless to say. But I stole one dungeon, and it had like a Sudoku puzzle in it in order to like solve something. And my players absolutely loved it. And like I don't even really know what Sudoku is, to be honest. I've never done Sudoku. I don't know, it's just something that never really interested me. But unfortunately, a bunch of my players did know what it was, and they knew exactly how to go about it. And so they all just worked on the puzzle and solved the thing, and they just thought that was the greatest thing ever, that they were able to do that. Now, I will caution you that if the entire party is like me, and they don't know anything about Sudoku, and the only way for them to achieve the objective is to do this puzzle that they have probably no reasonable expectation of being able to do, you could be in trouble. But, that's one reason why you need to kind of like have an idea of what kind of stuff your players like. Some of my players really like puzzles and traps and stuff. Some of my players don't, and so I don't try to go overboard with traps and stuff. Going back to immersion real quickly, then I think we're going to end things. Another thing that I think can really break immersion is just stupid traps in stupid places. Like, Tomb of Annihilations, this is one of my biggest problems with it, is that like, sometimes it just seems to be traps there for the sole purpose of killing players. And if the dungeon, now in Tomb of Annihilation's case, there's not really any living creatures, they're mostly all undead, right? So that's not quite so bad. But if you have a dungeon and it's occupied with orcs, and the orcs have a sphere of annihilation in the well, how are they going to get their water? Like, it makes no sense that they would do that. If the whole thing is undead, they don't need water. So maybe that does work. Who knows, right? The point is, though, that, if you have, like, scythe traps that, like, come down the hallway and decapitate anybody who goes down the hallway if they activate the pressure plate, that's going to kill the orcs, too. Are you telling me that the orcs are like, oh, no, we just always remember not to activate our scythe trap? That doesn't seem very realistic. But if maybe it's a bunch of goblins, and the scythes are set 5 feet high, and the goblins now use this trap because they, like, get in a fight, they run away, they lure people down the hallway, and the scythes don't hurt the goblins because they're way too short. Now all of a sudden you have a trap that makes perfect sense for the goblins. They can use this as an offensive and defensive weapon, and you don't have this like, but why would the goblins want that there? It's like, oh, okay, this is why they want it there. They don't have to worry about it. It's not going to hurt them, I like those kind of traps a lot better. Lord of the Rings, the whole like speak friend and enter. Those kind of things can be really cool sometimes. But again, use them with caution, because if your players never think to speak friend in Elven, then much like in the Lord of the Rings, they could just be sitting there for hours and hours and hours while Gandalf tries casting every spell in the universe, and that can be very, very frustrating for your, champion fighter who's just like, just came here to hit things, bro. That's it. Just wanted to hit things with an axe, maybe a sword. I mean, I've got a maul. Chon's carrying 3 other weapons for me. I just wanted to hit something with one of those weapons. Not even all. Just 1 or 2 of those weapons. Maybe 3 tops. So, have other ways of the players accomplishing things. Now, hopefully your players are clever, and things like, a large reduce could just drop that door down to miniature size, and now it just falls off its hinges. Maybe they have a pass wall, and you're like, well, if we can't go through the door, we can just go around the door. That's one great thing about D&D. Clever players should be able to find other ways to deal with it. But some scenarios, the walls are all immune to pass wall and etherealness and everything else that players might have wanted to do, because you wanted to have your magic door with your one way to achieve victory, and the players never think of it, and now it's just completely ruined your night because it's incredibly frustrating. And you're just like, how hard is it for you to just say friend in Elvish, guys? Come on. But they don't think about that. They're trying knock. They're trying their wand of knock spell. They're trying their staff of knocking. They're trying everything else that has anything to do with the knock spell, and not getting it. That the knock spell doesn't seem to be working for them. So like I said, don't be afraid to have other ways of achieving victory. Anyways, I'm starting to ramble a lot. This video was supposed to be about dungeons and ended up being all over the place. But those were my main thoughts. I want to talk a little bit about the history of dungeons and the evolution of gameplay. I want to talk about how you can have roleplay in dungeons. I want to talk about making better dungeons and evoking atmosphere. And somehow I did manage to touch on each of those subjects. So I think we're just going to call that a win. So that's everything I have. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like if you actually still made it this far and liked the video. You don't have to like it if you didn't like it. I will understand on this video. It's perfectly acceptable. But if you did like it, feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and of course, leave me your comments in the comment section. I look forward to reading them. Thank you. Bye.